welcome listeners of history. The lake was frozen when Louis-François Ducharme wrote his first line. The water was still under ice. Those words are now all that survive of the Abenaki of the water. Why do you think some histories are preserved while others are allowed to disappear? Write your answer below and let's see how many voices remember. The lake was still under ice when I first reached the camp of the Abenaki, and yet their canoes rested on the bank as if ready for departure. This single line opens the first folio of the field journal of L.F. Ducharme, Provincial Surveyor, Department of Crown Lands, dated March 2, 1895. The notebook, now held in the Archives Nationales du Quebec, begins without preface, without introduction of purpose. It reads as a technical record, but between its lines appears the outline of a people standing at the threshold of disappearance. The handwriting is narrow, with measured spacing between each word, written in the pale brown ink typical of late 19th century field pens. The entries are numbered each, followed by coordinates, weather conditions, and a summary of terrain. Yet, in the margins where he notes inhabitants observed or temporary encampment along the inlet, the language momentarily breaks from surveyor's precision into quiet observation. The dwellings, he writes, are shaped in a semicircle framed in cedar poles and roofed with birch bark. 2 are covered instead with oilcloth, perhaps purchased from traders at Sherbrooke. There are 7 families here, numbering in all 26 souls. They are known locally as the Abenaki of the water, in distinction to those who dwell inland. There is no overt curiosity, only the documentation of what he sees. But his eye, trained to measure distances and elevations, records with an inadvertent intimacy the physical life of the settlement. Each canoe is drawn above the frost line and inverted, secured by willow stakes. Fish traps of spruce are visible along the shallow stream. The men wear wool coats of trade pattern. The women printed cotton dresses with aprons of coarse linen. All possess the air of having lived long in transition between shore and forest, between their language and ours. The entry proceeds for several pages, alternating between field data and ethnographic notations. On the 5th page, Ducharme Sabrestabnes mentions the name of the leader. Met with Pierre Nolka, said to be chief or principal speaker. Speaks French readily, though with accent. Claims descent from the group once settled near Saint-François-du-Lac, relocated here following the decline of the mission. States their movement is governed by the fish, not by the township boundaries. The next passage is written without indentation, the rhythm continuous. They remain near the water until the thaw, then follow the channel toward the southern shore. When asked their number in total, Nolka replied, "As many as can still carry the paddles." The statement is brief, but its meaning is unmissable. The surveyor, intent on completing his geographic measurements, copies it down as a phrase of record, not metaphor. Yet for the historian reading more than a century later, it stands as quiet testimony of endurance under erasure. Below the main body of text, a single line appears in smaller script. Note, women seen mending nets by firelight. One child singing low. No description of the song. No mention of tone or language, only its occurrence. This is how the lives of the Abenaki of the water enter the archive as fragments inside a notebook meant for land division, not for memory. Over the following days, Ducharme adds weather summaries, sketches of shoreline curvature and distances between inlets. But every entry returns, however briefly, to the same human presence that anchors the landscape. March 4th. Ice beginning to lift near the reed beds. Canoes made ready. The families speak of traveling toward Lake Meganic before the melt. Their goods consist of traps, cedar baskets, and a carved crucifix hung near the doorway of each dwelling. There is no interpretation, no remark on belief, only the note of its physical existence. The surveyor's neutrality, at once bureaucratic and precise, leaves a silence that speaks for itself. At the bottom of that first week's record, between the coordinates and the signature line, appears one last observation before he moves northward. Of the older people, few remember the mission tongue. Of the children, none write. Yet they retain the names of the lakes in their own speech. Then, a line separating entry from blank page. End of station num 1 March 6th, 1895. The pencil mark is straight and deliberate. The following page begins with elevation data and river depth soundings. But for a moment between those final words and the sterile numbers that follow the image remains a small settlement by a frozen lake. Canoes waiting for thaw, voices still speaking the names of their waters. And that is where the record begins. The document known as the Field Journal of L.F. Ducharme is part of a series of survey notebooks produced between 1888 and 1897 under the supervision of the Department of Crown Lands Province of Quebec. The department, headquartered in Quebec City, was responsible for mapping timber limits, watercourses, and settlements along the frontier regions of Estrie and the upper Saint-François watershed. Ducharme's assignment in early 1895 fell within this wider administrative program following the 1894 directive titled Survey of the Frontier Parishes and Native Camps. The order, signed by Deputy Commissioner Charles E. Perron, instructed that all surveyors operating near provincial borders should record, in addition to topographic data, the condition of Indigenous families residing on Crown lands, their numbers, and the nature of their occupations. Louis-François Ducharme was born in 1856 in Trois-Rivières and educated in civil engineering at the École Polytechnique de Montréal. His fieldwork throughout the 1880s focused primarily on timber and mineral surveys, not ethnography. His notebooks follow a consistent format: weather observations, compass bearing sketches, and brief remarks on inhabitants encountered. In this sense, the 1895 Quebec Frontier Journal differs from his earlier volumes only in its geographic scope and in the administrative expectation that Indigenous presence be quantified as part of Crown documentation. The notebook that survives today is written in French, bound in dark brown leather with the initials LFD embossed on the cover. It contains 42 folios, each measuring 15 by 23 centimeters. The handwriting, though consistent, shows signs of fatigue toward the later pages, uneven spacing, and faded ink, likely due to field conditions. The first 15 pages concern the region surrounding Lac Saint-François, situated near the present-day boundary between Quebec and Maine. The original manuscript was deposited in the Archives nationales du Québec Fonds du Ministère des Terres et Forêts, catalogued under reference code P324, Série 7E, number 11. A transcription was prepared in 1972 by archivist Jean Lapointe as part of the Projet de microfilmage des journaux des arpenteurs. That transcription, reproduced on typewritten sheets, forms the basis of the current English translation. The translator's preface attached to the 1972 edition clarifies the method used. All terms relating to measurement, land division, and Indigenous terminology have been retained in their original form, whenever possible. Where a term was unclear, square brackets have been inserted with modern equivalents. This editorial approach preserves the scientific neutrality of the original record while allowing accessibility for modern readers. The portion concerning the Abenaki settlement, referred to by Ducharme as Les Abenakis de l'eau, literally Abenaki of the water, occupies pages 1 through 8 of the notebook. Subsequent sections concern only forestry and topography, suggesting that his encounter with the community occurred within the first week of his expedition. Internal evidence such as temperature readings and daylight hours places the observations between March 2nd and March 6, 1895 during a late winter survey conducted along the southern tributaries feeding into the Saint-François River basin. The survey area itself had long served as a seasonal zone for Abenaki travel. Historical maps from the late 18th century, including Joseph Bouchet's Topographical Dictionary of Lower Canada, 1815, mark the area as containing Indian portage routes connecting the interior lakes with the Kennebec River system to the south. By the 1890s, however, most Indigenous movement across the frontier was subject to restrictions imposed by both Canadian and U.S. customs regulations. The survey directives of the Crown Lands Department were therefore not neutral exercises in cartography, but components of broader land administration intended to delimit territory for settlement and resource extraction. The 1895 directive explicitly instructed surveyors to report upon any encampments or settlements of Indians found within or adjacent to surveyed limits, noting their mode of subsistence and any interference with timber cutting or settlement. Ducharme's compliance with this clause explains the ethnographic precision of his opening entries. Although his observations appear descriptive and impartial, they were compiled within a bureaucratic framework that regarded indigenous families as data relevant to land management. Archival correspondence between Ducharme and departmental headquarters further contextualizes his journal. A surviving letter dated December 28, 1894, filed under Crown Lands Outgoing Valorum 391, confirms his commission. You are instructed to proceed by rail to Sherbrooke, and thence to the upper tributaries of the Saint Francois River for the purpose of extending township boundary lines as far as the international frontier. Take note of any Indian camps or settlements, encountered their number, approximate population, and chief means of subsistence. Particular attention should be given to any occupation of Crown timber lands. The notebook thus served both as a technical report and as evidence of compliance with this directive. No subsequent publication or summary of his findings appeared in departmental bulletins, suggesting that his notes remained an internal record until the early 20th century. The rediscovery of the document occurred in 1968, when archivist Jean-Paul Clément began cataloging unsorted field notebooks held in storage at the Provincial Archives in Hull, now Gatineau. The Ducharme Journal was located among unprocessed materials transferred from the defunct Crown Lands office in Sherbrooke. A brief entry in the 1970 annual report of the archives lists it among Journaux d'Arpenteurs, 1884, 1897, acquis par transfert administratif. Since its reclassification, the journal has been cited in several historical studies relating to Eastern Abenaki demography, including Le Peuple de la Rivière, Les Abenakis au tournant du siècle universel, Laval 1981, and Frontiers of Settlement, Mapping the Eastern Provinces, McGill University Press, 1994. Scholars have regarded it as a rare example of direct field observation of Abenaki families during the late period of subsistence mobility, before the full enforcement of federal assimilation policies. The English version used in this documentary is based on the 1972 transcription verified against high-resolution microfilm held at the Bibliothèque et Archives Nationales du Quebec Montreal branch. No attempt has been made to modernize punctuation or spelling beyond what is necessary for clarity. Dates, coordinates, and technical references are preserved as in the source. The author himself, Louis-François Ducharme, continued to serve with the department until his retirement in 1912. His obituary, published in Le Devoir on May 17th of that year, described him as a quiet man of the compass and the chain devoted to the service of the province. There's no mention of his ethnographic notes, and no evidence that he maintained correspondence with any of the communities he recorded. His field equipment and notebooks were transferred to departmental custody upon his death, consistent with regulations requiring the return of all official materials. In establishing the context of this journal, 3 facts are clear. First, that the text was not intended as a cultural record, but as an administrative document. Second, that its author was neither missionary nor anthropologist, but a civil servant. And third, that its survival was accidental, the consequence of archival procedure rather than design. For historical analysis, the journal stands at the intersection of government cartography and indigenous presence. It offers no commentary, no reflection, only the raw entries of a man measuring territory at the edge of a fading world. Its neutrality, while deliberate, allows the modern reader to reconstruct the circumstances of contact more precisely than sentiment could. The physical notebook remains preserved in climate-controlled storage in Quebec City. Access is granted under standard conditions for archival consultation, and digital microfilm copies are available for research. Each page carries a faint imprint of field dust and water stains, testifying to its origin not in office correspondence, but in the wet cold of the Quebec frontier. This is the document's frame, written in 1895 by a provincial surveyor commissioned to map the edge of Crown Lands. Rediscovered in 1968, catalogued in 1970, and transcribed in 1972. Translated for scholarly reference half a century later. Its significance lies not in intention, but in survival. From this foundation, the record proceeds. The opening entries of the Field Journal of L.F. Ducharme for March 1895 describe the conditions of the Quebec frontier at the tail end of winter. The handwriting is uniform, with deliberate strokes and narrow margins. The ink varies in density, suggesting exposure to cold and moisture. The content, however, remains consistent in tone. Precise, detached, and methodical. The first dated entry reads as follows. March 2, 1895. Weather clear, temperature at sunrise -12 degrees. Ice covering the surface of the lake, estimated thickness 2 feet, though beginning to soften near the inlets. Proceeded eastward along the northern shore to verify township boundary. Encountered evidence of recent habitation, ashes of firefish bones, and a small platform of poles extending over the ice. Traces of snowshoes visible leading toward a cluster of dwellings situated approximately 100 yards from the bank. He continues without pause. Approached the encampment at 10 o'clock in the morning. Observed smoke from 3 hearths. Structures appear temporary, composed of cedar and birch bark, oval in form, 6 to 10 feet in height. A total of 7 lodges counted, forming a semicircle open toward the water. Spoke first with a man who identified himself in French as Pierre Nolka, calling the place our winter water home. He stated that his people move between this lake and the southern tributary each season, following the fish as they move upstream. The next line is underlined in the original. Population present 26 persons, 8 men, 9 women, 9 children. They possess 4 canoes, each of cedar plank stored inverted on wooden supports above the snow line. Below this, in smaller script, Ducharme adds, domestic animals, 1 dog. Implements observed 3 steel traps, 2 hatchets, 1 saw of trade pattern nets suspended between poles, and several baskets of split ash. I noted that their clothing is of mixed material. Hudson's Bay blankets, wool coats, and cotton garments. 1 woman wore a rosary about her neck. When asked about their subsistence, Nolka replied, "The water gives us fish. The forest gives us wood. The traders give us what remains." The entry for March 3rd expands upon the settlement's location in relation to the landscape. Site situated at latitude 45 degrees 40'12" near the western end of Lac Saint-François. Land rises gently to the north forest of spruce and birch. Soil frozen. Water beneath the ice flows from northwest to southeast. Noted several paths worn into the snow leading inland, apparently toward a hunting line or sugar bush. Smoke observed in distance at 4 p.m., possibly from secondary encampment. The tone of these early records remains neutral. Ducharme appears primarily concerned with classification and distance. Yet, at several moments, his notes reflect a brief, unintended recognition of cultural continuity. The chief, or headman, maintains a ledger of their movements written in French on scraps of paper. He records the dates of departure and return for each season. This practice suggests prior instruction by missionaries or teachers. When asked, he stated that his grandfather learned writing at the old mission at Saint-François-du-Lac before it was closed. He showed me a crucifix said to have belonged to that place. No commentary follows. The next line resumes with a change of subject. Examined the shoreline for purposes of triangulation. Established marker post at 200 yards east of camp. Recorded bearing to southern promontory. Ice stable. March 4th includes further notes on interaction with the inhabitants. Weather moderate, -5 degrees. Snow falling lightly. Visited the camp at 8:30 a.m. Found the men repairing nets and frames for canoes. Women engaged in boiling sap from cut branches producing syrup of dark color. Children observed carrying water from ice hole. Language spoken among them incomprehensible to me, though some words resemble those of the Algonquin tongue as heard in Abitibi. When addressed in French, the adults responded courteously but without elaboration. He writes later that day, "At noon I measured the distance across the bay, approximately 1 mile. The ice begins to crack in center. The people state that within a fortnight, they will depart toward the southern shore as soon as the current becomes free. They appear well accustomed to this movement, preparing sleds of spruce upon which to load their possessions. The precision of measurement contrasts with the human observations, yet both coexist in the same linear script. On March 5th, Ducharme records a longer passage concerning his attempt to map the settlement's internal arrangement. Each dwelling is set facing the water door flaps of bark interior heated by open fire in center. Vent at top made by removal of bark panel. The smoke escapes slowly, forming a blue column. Mats of woven reed cover the ground. Sleeping places are arranged around the wall, separated by bark partitions. I was shown a pair of snowshoes, finely laced with rawhide. The workmanship exceeds that of most trade goods encountered in frontier posts. He adds a technical description of their tools. A small forge of stone near one dwelling indicates capacity for metalwork. One of the men was sharpening an iron point, possibly for use as spearhead. The implements for woodworking are European, yet their use is distinctly indigenous. A wooden paddle unfinished shows decoration of notched lines along the shaft, apparently symbolic, but unexplained. The next notation, without transition, records an exchange. Questioned Nolka on the ownership of land along the shore. He replied that the land belongs to no man, only the water, and that they come here by the right of their fathers. He stated further, we do not cut the timber beyond the trees we need. The sentence following is practical. I noted this remark as of possible importance regarding timber concessions. This is typical of the tone throughout the first half of the journal. Each indigenous statement is transcribed as a matter of record, followed by an administrative observation. There is no reflection on the meaning or implication of what was said. On March 6th, the final entry from the first segment of the notebook appears. It marks the end of Ducharme's initial visit before he proceeded northward. Morning temperature -9 degrees. Ice thinning near the inlet. Observed preparation for movement. Nets with drawn canoes, lifted sleds loaded with bark rolls and tools. The women packed baskets with flour and salt. The dog harnessed to a small sledge. I asked whether they intended to return. Nolka answered, when the ice forms again, we will be here. Ducharme's only comment follows beneath in smaller letters. They exhibit regularity of movement corresponding to the seasons, indicating long establishment in this locality. The first 8 pages of the notebook conclude with 2 final notations, separated by a drawn line. Specimens collected: birch bark, sample of ash. Basket fragment of fishnet. End of station number 1, March 6, 1895. The factual nature of these early records temperatures coordinates quantities. Brief quotations reflects the utilitarian purpose of the mission. Yet these fragments remain among the few surviving first-hand observations of the eastern Abenaki communities still living in seasonal water settlements at the close of the 19th century. Beyond the technical data, the writer neither speculates nor interprets. His role is purely administrative, yet his ledger preserves the cadence of life along the frozen lakes of the Quebec frontier. Every sentence stands as an unembellished entry in the ongoing measurement of land, and its people recorded without expectation of remembrance. The Ducharme Field Journal of March 1895 does not exist in isolation. Several other records written between 1894 and 1897 address the same region and describe encounters with Abenaki families living along the St. Francois River basin. When read together, these sources reveal inconsistencies not in basic geography, but in perception differences in how observers defined residence, occupation, and presence. And the first relevant comparison comes from a quarterly report of the Indian Affairs Office, Ottawa, dated April 1895, prepared by Inspector T.J. Blanchard following his tour of eastern townships. His memorandum, filed under the title, Condition of Wandering Bands, Province of Quebec, contains the following passage. A small group of Abenakis was found in temporary occupation of the lake shore near the frontier line, south of St. Francis. Their number did not exceed a dozen. They appeared to have erected rude shelters of bark, not permanent, and were engaged in snaring fish through the ice. They claim to migrate with the season returning to St. Francis Village when water navigation opens. They are under no formal supervision and are believed to have abandoned regular settlement for itinerant life. Their chief, calling himself Pierre Nolke Sikh, professed loyalty to the government and expressed willingness to move should the land be required. The discrepancy is immediate. Blanchard reports 12 persons, while Ducharme records 26. The spelling of the headman's name differs, as does the interpretation of the settlement's permanence. Ducharme's notebook notes regularity of movement corresponding to the seasons, indicating long establishment, whereas Blanchard defines it as temporary occupation. Both accounts describe the same man, the same location, but their administrative purposes diverge, one mapping the other supervising. A further divergence appears in the missionary correspondence of Father Etienne Lafrenière, a Jesuit stationed at Saint-François-du-Lac, whose letter of May 1895 to the Bishop of Nicolet refers to the same community. A remnant of the Abenaki people persists in following their ancestral practice of wintering by the frontier lakes. They maintain that their fathers fished those waters long before the border existed. Some of them I have known since childhood. Among them, Pierre Nolke, who was baptized in this parish. They are not vagabonds, but poor. I have urged them to remain near the mission for the sake of instruction, yet they return each year to the water as if drawn by a promise older than ours. Here, the priest's perspective conflicts with both government accounts. Where Ducharme measures and Blanchard classifies, Lafrenière defends. He regards their movement not as transience, but as tradition. The statement, "They are not vagabonds, but poor," stands in tension with the Ottawa Report's phrase, "wandering bands." In 1896, the Commissioner of Fisheries for the province of Quebec, Louis B. Turgeon, submitted a separate complaint concerning unauthorized netting in frontier waters. His report to the Legislative Assembly's Surveillance des Lacs Frontaliers includes an entry referencing the same lake. Repeated seizures of nets have occurred at the western end of Lac Saint-François, where Indians from the St. Francis Reserve are said to establish winter camps. Their operations interfere with local settlers engaged in ice fishing concessions. It is doubtful whether such persons hold any recognized rights under provincial law. The department may wish to consider measures to prevent their seasonal return. This passage, while not naming individuals, reflects an official shift from observation to regulation. The phrase, "prevent their seasonal return," introduces the administrative rationale for limiting Indigenous access to the lakes, an intent absent from Ducharme's neutral record. 2 years later, a counter-memorandum was filed by Joseph Alphonse Lemoyne, Crown Lands Clerk at Sherbrooke, dated February 1897, in response to local petitions. His note offers yet another version. In review of complaints received concerning Indian camps on the frontier lakes, I visited the locality. Found evidence of old encampments, but no present occupation. Local settlers affirmed that such people have not returned since the winter of 1895. Some state that they have moved southward into Maine for trade. It is my opinion that they no longer frequent this part of the province. The assertion that they no longer frequent this part of the province contradicts later oral census data recorded by the Department of Indian Affairs, which still listed families at large St. Francois band as late as 1901. The official narrative of disappearance thus began before actual absence. Another document preserved in the Hudson's Bay Company Post Ledger-Megantic Station provides a commercial perspective. Entry dated March 15, 1895. Traded with 2 Indians from the frontier lake baskets and syrup in exchange for flour and tobacco. They stated they would return before the ice broke to fetch further supplies. The elder spoke French well. He said the water was their road. The storekeeper does not record names, but notes 2 Indians from the frontier lake, confirming both timing and activity. The phrase, "the water was their road," echoes Ducharme's translation of Nolke's earlier remark, "The water gives us fish, the forest gives us wood, the traders give us what remains." The similarity suggests consistent testimony among the people themselves, even as outside reports diverged. Further contradiction arises in a provincial census supplement compiled by agent Charles Larocque in 1896 for Le District de Compton. In his annex, he lists Abenakis itinerant 8 persons 1 family group. The footnote reads, "They pass the winter near the lakes, return in spring to St. Francis. Their condition, fair, no destitution observed." The number 8 persons again conflicts with both Ducharme's 26 and Blanchard's 12. Whether the discrepancy reflects partial observation or administrative compression cannot be determined. A different tone appears in a letter to the editor of the Sherbrooke Gazette, published April 20, 1895, written by a settler identifying himself as H.L. Township of Woburn. "I wish to call attention to the band of Indians encamped these past weeks near the lower lake. They have been taking fish through the ice in considerable quantity, drying them upon poles. Some of our residents complain that this depletes the catch. Others consider them harmless. Their camp, though rough, is orderly. The men are polite when spoken to, the women industrious. I saw one family depart yesterday by sled toward the woods. The description corresponds closely to Ducharme's entry of March 6, though framed as a local observation. Its neutrality contrasts with the administrative tone of the Ottawa and Quebec reports. An additional missionary record written by Father Lafreniere in October 1895 provides a retrospective remark that subtly questions the official interpretation. The people from the water returned briefly after midsummer to trade baskets. They reported that an officer had written their names and numbers. They asked whether it meant they must leave. I told them I could not answer. They seemed resigned. The man Nolka said only, 'We are counted like trees.'" This phrase, "counted like trees," reappears in later ethnographic commentary cited by anthropologist Jacques Rousseau in his 1948 essay, Les Derniers Abenakis Nomades. Rousseau quotes the missionary's note as evidence of administrative categorization preceding displacement. Within this network of documents, the surveyor's notebook, the inspector's report, the missionary's letters, the fisheries complaint, the local newspaper, and the later clerical review each describes the same event from within its institutional purpose. The Department of Crown Lands sought to record presence for mapping. The Indian Affairs Office sought to regulate mobility. The mission sought to preserve souls and habit. The settlers sought to defend their livelihood. The company trader sought only to note an exchange. Nowhere among these records appears the voice of the Abenaki people themselves, except in the brief quotations transcribed by others. An archival comparison conducted by historian Lucy Tremblay in 1989 examined the quantitative data of these reports. She concluded that the numerical discrepancies suggest deliberate undercounting in administrative correspondence intended to minimize recognition of unsupervised Indigenous residents. Her study, Presence non consignee, found that the higher numbers in Ducharme's technical notes were consistent with contemporaneous baptismal records listing extended families under the name Nolka Nolka Obomsawin and related lineages. In contrast, Blanchard's 12 and Larocque's 8 would imply single households detached from any larger band. The reduction of count over successive documents illustrates how bureaucratic frameworks translated sustained occupation into perceived transience. The conflicting records thus form a composite Ducharme's observation of 26 individuals in a regular seasonal pattern. Blanchard's classification of 12 wanderers without fixed residence. Lafreniere's defense of a baptized community following ancestral custom. Turgeon's complaint regarding illegal fishing. Lemoyne's assertion of their disappearance 2 years later, and an unnamed settler's neutral notice of their industry and order. Each document retains its institutional logic, and none can be verified entirely against the others. The contradictions lie not in the facts of time or place, but in definition, what constitutes a community, what marks permanence, and what, in administrative terms, defines existence. The archival trail, though composed of official prose, exposes the gradual translation of human continuity into administrative absence. The early record measured presence. Later ones measured compliance. By the end of 1897, the name Abenakis of the Water disappears from departmental registers, replaced by the more general designation Wandering Indians Eastern Lakes. Whether the people themselves ceased to travel or merely ceased to be recorded, the documents do not say. What remains are the contradictions, the differing numbers, the alternate spellings, the incompatible purposes, each preserved in its own archive, each claiming authority, each fragmentary. Together they form the rising incident of history, a single community refracted through the lens of bureaucracy, religion, commerce, and settlement, leaving behind no uniform truth, only the measured dissonance of the record itself. The later portion of the Field Journal of L.F. Ducharme resumes on March 12, 1895, 6 days after the closing note of Station No. 1. The heading reads, "Continuation of survey tributary south of St. Francois Lake." The entries from this date to the end of the month cover new ground topographic lines, water measurements, and brief but telling references to the same Abenaki group encountered earlier in the month. The first continuation reads, March 12th. Weather variable thaw beginning in the lower elevations, proceeded along the southern stream leading into the lake, discovered traces of sled runners on the bank and ashes of extinguished fire. Examined prints same narrow pattern as seen at Station 1. Indicates the same people have passed this way within the week. Estimated movement toward the south shore, he adds. The snow crust softened, making travel slow. Found discarded bark roll possibly covering from one of their lodges. It shows burn marks at edge, perhaps used as lining for canoe. The next page contains his only direct encounter after the initial survey, March 14th. At midday, met 2 of the Indians by the bend of the river, man and woman. They were drawing a sled with their effects iron pot, bundle of nets, and small dog. They recognized me from the lake. The man said the others had gone ahead to prepare the crossing near the lower rapids. He offered a dried fish as token of courtesy. I gave them tobacco and salt in exchange. Their demeanor quiet, respectful. Both appeared tired from travel. A marginal note follows. These movements confirm the seasonal migration described by Nolka. They follow the current, precisely halting where the ice remains firm. Later that evening, Ducharme writes, "At camp observed aurora. River cracking under thaw. In distance, faint glow of fire. Could hear voices through words indistinct." On March 16th, a longer entry appears likely written at rest 2 days later, based on the handwriting variation. Reached the southern inlet. Found remains of larger encampment fires, still warm poles erected for drying fish. Several fish heads found frozen on stakes. Tracks leading east along shore. Collected small wooden cross from ground, possibly marker for burial or prayer. He does not speculate on meaning, only records dimensions. Cross measures 12 inches, roughly carved from spruce cord of sinew attached. On March 17th, Ducharme writes the most extensive single passage of the surviving manuscript. It summarizes his observations in the manner of a technical conclusion. The population of the lake region consists of 2 or more family groups belonging to the Abenaki tribe. Their occupation is fishing, hunting, and basket making. They construct temporary dwellings of bark each winter on the frozen shore, departing southward at thaw. Their movement is constant, yet organized. They show no sign of destitution. Tools and clothing of European origin are obtained by trade. The women possess skill in weaving and the manufacture of nets. Religious symbols observed crucifix in each lodge, indicating continued adherence to Christian instruction received formerly at St. Francis Mission. The entry continues in formal summary style consistent with departmental reporting. In their manner and speech, they present the appearance of having adapted partially to civilized life, yet prefer the independence of their seasonal mode. They cultivate no ground, but depend on the resources of water and forest. Their children speak both tongues imperfectly. After this description, he records an administrative reflection. I recommend that should settlement extend to this locality, notice be given to these families in advance to allow their removal without disturbance. That line constitutes the only policy suggestion in the entire notebook. The journal then turns to field data, distances, bearings, and elevations until a brief personal notation reappears on March 21st. Return to Lower Lake. Encountered remains of sled track disappearing into open water. Ice breaking rapidly near outlet. No persons seen. 2 canoes visible half submerged by shore. He sketches a small diagram of their placement and adds, "The canoes appear intact, but no trace of owners. Possibly they have crossed already. River current strong carrying fragments of bark and wood." The next page, marked March 23rd, contains his last direct reference to the Abenaki of the water. Visited opposite bank by borrowed canoe from settlers. Found campsite deserted. Embers cold. Noted prints of moccasins frozen in ice. Collected sample for record. Believed the party moved toward Megantic Passage. A separate section labeled Observations upon Native Camps encountered in March 1895 occupies the closing pages. It is a formalized report written likely after return to Sherbrooke. The language is administrative, devoid of narrative. I have encountered within the surveyed district 2 groups of Indians belonging to the St. Francis Band, numbering in all approximately 26 souls. They reside temporarily along the lakes and rivers adjoining the frontier. Their conduct peaceful. They maintain no fixed dwellings, but return annually to the same locality. They cause no interference to settlers. They claim ancestral right of fishery and travel by water route, connecting the lakes to the south. It is observed that the land they occupy is Crown property, but of little present value. The concluding paragraph provides the official closure expected by his department. No action recommended at present. Should future development arise, arrangements may be made through the Department of Indian Affairs for their removal to St. Francis Reserve. Until such time, their presence is not detrimental to public interests. A double line marks the end of the journal. In the appendices of the 1972 transcription, archivist Jean Lapointe added 2 items preserved alongside the notebook, 1 unsigned memorandum and 1 letter fragment. The memorandum on departmental stationery reads, "Received from Mr. L.F. Ducharme, April the 10th, 1895. 1 notebook containing field notes of survey at St. Francis Frontier, including observations on Indian camps. To be filed with Crown Lands Reports Eastern Division." The second item, written in Ducharme's hand on separate paper, is addressed to Mr. Perron, Deputy Commissioner. "Sir, I have completed the inspection of the frontier section assigned to me. The country is heavily wooded and sparsely inhabited. The only occupants observed of native origin are those noted in my report. They appear industrious and orderly. I found no cause for complaint. Respectfully submitted, L.F. Ducharme, Provincial Surveyor." No further correspondence from him on the subject appears in departmental archives after 1895. Outside the notebook, the later record of government action shows gradual enforcement of new regulations. In the Crown Timber Act amendments of 1896, a clause designated Section 34B prohibited residence or encampment upon unsurveyed Crown lands without license. The Act did not mention Indigenous persons by name, but internal circulars clarified its application. A letter from Deputy Commissioner Parent to field officers dated August 1896 states, "All Indians occupying Crown lands beyond the limits of their reserves are to be regarded as unauthorized settlers. In cases where such occupancy is temporary and peaceful, report should be made, but no forcible removal attempted." This directive formalized what Ducharme had implied acknowledgement without protection. A subsequent inspector's return. St. Francis Agency 1897 makes a passing reference. The so-called water families have not been seen this winter. They are believed to have gone southward. After that note, the record closes. No further mention of Pierre Nolka or his people appears in departmental papers after 1897. In the 1972 transcription, Lapointe appended a brief analytical note referencing an earlier cross-index. The absence of further reference to these individuals in provincial correspondence may indicate either their relocation to the United States or administrative omission following reorganization of field surveys. She offers no interpretation beyond that. One additional primary source, however, extends the timeline. In the parish register of Saint François du Lac, under January 1901, appears a baptismal record for Marie, Nolka Fille de Pierre, Nolka et de Josephine P. The margin contains the notation parents absent baptized upon request of local missionary residents, uncertain. This entry, found by historian Lucy Tremblay in 1988, constitutes the last verifiable trace of the family within Quebec jurisdiction. The accumulated evidence. Ducharme's field notes, his closing report, departmental directives, and ecclesiastical records form a consistent chronological sequence of observation documentation and administrative silence. From these later portions, the facts are clear. By March 1895, the Abenaki of the water were still present in defined family groups along Lac Saint-François. Their movements were annual, systematic, and recorded in official observation. By mid-1896, new legislation classified their seasonal encampment as unauthorized residence. By 1897, inspectors declared their absence. By 1901, only a single baptismal record survived. Each datum exists in the language of record-keeping, not narrative. No event of displacement is documented, only the gradual reduction of entries in official files. The sequence ends not with a reported incident, but with the cessation of notation. In the margins of Ducharme's final page, beneath the ruled line, an almost illegible sentence can be made out under ultraviolet scan. No further observation, ice-breaking departure complete. That line, undated and unreferenced, stands as the last sentence in the surviving manuscript. It closes the factual record of the Abenaki of the water. The final portion of the field journal of L.F. Ducharme begins without heading. The pagination continues from the previous section, page 41, but the format changes. There are no coordinate listings, no weather observations. Only 2 pages contain text written in faded ink, unevenly aligned with the ruled lines of the paper. The handwriting appears hurried, less controlled than in earlier entries. The first line reads, March 28th River, open to a width of nearly 100 yards. Strong current from the west. Ice remains along shore in fragments. Sky clear. Temperature above freezing. A second line follows immediately beneath. Observed on opposite bank remains of encampment recently abandoned. 3 poles upright, cloth torn away. Small fire pit containing charred wood and fish bones. No signs of persons. After a space, he adds, a piece of bark lodged between stones bears inscription in pencil, partly legible, Saint-François, return and fall. Collected for record. This is the last instance of quotation from the Abenaki group. The next paragraph resumes the detached tone of a surveyor. Water level rising rapidly. Danger to crossing. Will return north by main route tomorrow. A notation in the left margin reads, end of traverse. Below it, in smaller script, equipment intact, no further observation of Indians. The next page contains what appears to be a summary, but the sentences are incomplete. Some words trailing off into lines or smudges. The transcription, prepared in 1972, reproduced these gaps faithfully. The families formerly seen along the lake have broken camp. No trace except ashes and fragments of bark. The sound of water increases each day. The canoes left at the inlet are gone, possibly taken southward with the first clear passage. The place is silent. The following sentence is separated by a horizontal line. End of report, LFD. Yet below that, in smaller handwriting, a single continuation line appears. The archivist's transcription notes uncertainty as to whether it was written the same day or later. The water carries everything that was left. There are no further pages containing field notes. Page 43 is blank, except for a faint stain in the upper right corner. The rest of the notebook, 5 unused folios, is empty. Attached to the inside back cover of the notebook preserved by archivists is a folded sheet titled Observations Complementaires. The text is brief, possibly written after Ducharme's return to Sherbrooke. It repeats information already entered in the field journal, though in a condensed tabular form. The final row reads, Category Observation Indigenous Families, departed prior to completion of survey. Presumed movement to U.S. side. No contact after the 28th of March. No conclusion follows. The table ends midline without signature. From this point, the archival record of the Abenaki of the water ceases. No subsequent correspondence or field summary refers to their existence. In 1972, when archivist Jeanne Lapointe prepared her transcription, She added a footnote at the end of the typed text. The final entry on page 42 is written in a lighter ink and may have been added at a later date, though still by the same hand. The absence of further folios suggests that the author considered the survey completed or that remaining pages were lost. The phrase, "The water carries everything that was left," appears to be the last legible sentence in the notebook. When the microfilm copy was examined in 1989 during the Tremblay study, ultraviolet scanning confirmed faint marks on the facing page suggesting erased or water-damaged text. Only 2 words were recoverable, April and crossed. Their position indicates an attempt to begin a new entry that was never completed. From an archival perspective, the sudden cessation of documentation marks the boundary between recorded and unrecorded existence. The moment at which the notebook falls silent corresponds precisely to the administrative transition described in departmental records the following year, when water families were declared absent. The physical notebook shows no sign of deliberate erasure. The last written line, the one concerning water, remains clear under magnification. The paper around it is slightly darker, as though touched by moisture. Lapointe's inventory list for Fonds du Ministère des Terres et Forêts describes the volume's condition, leather cover intact. Ink faded on final folios. Moderate water damage along lower edges, possibly from field exposure. No supplementary pages are known to exist. In the 1972 microfilm edition, the final image captures the closing leaf blank except for the faint indentation of prior writing visible under angled light. It bears no annotation, no archival stamp beyond cataloging numbers added in 1968. Thus, the record ends not with summary or evaluation, but with the simple notation of absence. No further observation of Indians. The water carries everything that was left. After this, the rest is silence. There are no appended reports by Ducharme for April 1895. The departmental correspondence for that year contains routine communications regarding timber limits and boundary markers, but none referencing Indigenous presence. His next surviving field journal, dated June 1895, concerns measurements in the Abitibi region, 200 miles to the northwest. Its first line begins with new coordinates and makes no mention of the prior expedition. Between the final entry of the St. Francois journal and the opening of the next, there exists a space of 2 months, unrecorded and unexplained. Whether the surveyor ever saw the Abenaki of the water again is not known. From a chronological standpoint, the silence aligns with the administrative shift documented elsewhere. The 1896 report to the Legislative Assembly by Commissioner Perron lists no permanent Indian population along the frontier lakes. The absence of further notes by Ducharme becomes the factual corroboration of that statement, not through observation, but through omission. The climax of the record, therefore, is not discovery confrontation or event, it is cessation. The act of documentation itself halts. The observer who began his notebook by noting the lake was still under ice concludes with the water carries everything that was left. Between those two descriptions lies the transformation of presence into record and record into absence. Every subsequent historian, Lafrenière in 1895, Tremblay in 1989, Rousseau in 1948, encountered the same boundary. The notebook does not explain. It ends where sound ends the survey, complete the camp gone, the ink nearly dry. In archival terms, this is the climax, the point at which the line of writing becomes the line of silence. Beyond it, no supplementary log, no departmental appendix, no private correspondence, continues the story. The absence itself becomes the evidence. As of the last cataloging entry in Archives Nationales du Québec 2004, the item remains under reference P324, Series 7E, number 11. Its condition is described as stable. The ink of the final page remains visible. The archivist's note still identifies the closing line exactly as it appears. The water carries everything that was left. No commentary follows. That is where the document ends. The field journal of Louis-François Ducharme was never cited during his lifetime. After his retirement in 1912, His notebooks, together with maps, instruments, and correspondence, were transferred to the custody of the Department of Crown Lands in Quebec City. For more than 50 years, they remained unlisted in a wooden cabinet labeled Surveyor's Returns Eastern Division. The inventory compiled during periodic office reorganizations recorded only numbers and initials. No subject index existed. When the department was dissolved and absorbed into the new Ministry of Natural Resources in the 1960s, the contents of those cabinets were moved to a basement storeroom in Hull. It was there in the autumn of 1968 that archivist Jean-Paul Clément located the Ducharme notebook among other field journals from the 1880s and 1890s. The binding was intact, though warped by moisture. The paper, brittle at the edges, retained traces of soil and faint salt rings. Clément entered it into the accession register as Journal d'Arpentage, Saint-François, 1895. No further description was added. For several years, the notebook remained unexamined, stored with microfilm reels, awaiting processing. In 1971, as part of a pilot project to preserve provincial survey records, the notebook was transferred to Jeanne Lapointe, archivist in charge of transcription. Her 1972 typewritten edition, 48 pages on onion skin paper, became the first accessible version of the text. Lapointe reproduced each entry exactly as written, adding only footnotes to clarify geographic names and departmental abbreviations. She attached a one-page summary listing the principal subjects of the journal Survey of Lake Frontier. References to Abenaki families. Final note regarding departure: no further correspondence. Lapointe's transcript was microfilmed in 1973 under catalogue number F32411, forming part of the Journaux des Arpenteurs du Québec series. A copy was deposited at the Bibliothèque et Archives Nationales du Québec in Montreal, another at Laval University. The microfilm became the basis for later academic citations. The original notebook was retained in secure storage in Quebec City. In the years that followed, the journal attracted limited attention. Scholars studying land policy referred to it briefly as an example of late 19th century field reporting. It was not until the 1980s, during renewed interest in Indigenous history, that historians began to recognize its ethnographic value. In 1988, researcher Lucy Tremblay consulted the microfilm while preparing her study Présence non concernée, les Abenakis de l'eau. She noted the contrast between Ducharme's objective tone and the administrative disappearance of the community he described. Her article drew attention to the notebook's final sentence: "The water carries everything that was left," as emblematic of archival erasure. A subsequent re-examination of the original manuscript in 1989 by Tremblay and conservator Michel Hébert confirmed its authenticity. Using ultraviolet light, they identified marginal notes invisible on the microfilm, including the partial word April and a faint trace of crossed. Their report, filed in the conservation record, concluded that no additional text was recoverable. The notebook was then sealed in a protective enclosure and returned to controlled storage, where it remains today. The physical object occupies a single archival box marked P32411 Journal de Terrain L.F. Ducharme, 1895. The leather cover, darkened with age, bears the faint impression of fieldwear creases near the corners, a small indentation from the pressure of the brass compass once tied to it. The final pages, discolored by moisture, display the gradual fading of the ink from black to pale brown. The last line, however, remains legible. No correspondence letters or supplementary reports from Ducharme have been found that reference the Abenaki of the water. His subsequent notebooks, dating from 1895 to 1909, deal exclusively with timber limits and mineral surveys in other districts. The families he recorded are absent from all later departmental records. Outside the archives, only fragmentary traces of the community persist. Parish registers at Saint-François-du-Lac record a handful of baptisms and burials bearing the Nolka and Obumsawin names into the early 20th century, but none located specifically on the frontier lakes. By 1910, Census enumerations list no residents identified as Abenaki fishermen in the frontier parishes of Compton or Megantic. The name Nolka appears once more in the 1901 baptism of Marie Nolka, annotated residence uncertain. After that, no official record remains. In 1948, anthropologist Jacques Rousseau referenced a forgotten journal of a provincial surveyor in his essay Les Derniers Abenakis Nomades, quoting indirectly from the Lapointe transcription, but without citation. His paraphrase of Ducharme's final line, L'eau emporte tout ce qui reste, introduced the phrase into later scholarship as a symbolic expression of displacement. Yet Rousseau had never seen the original. His interpretation, while literary, preserved the wording that now identifies the notebook in research catalogs. The document's trajectory from field record to unlisted storage, from rediscovery to scholarly citation, illustrates the layered survival of colonial archives. The people it describes are known only through those administrative fragments. Their voices enter the record through another man's ink. As of the most recent verification report by the Bibliothèque et Archives Nationales du Québec 2021, the notebook remains in stable condition. Temperature and humidity are maintained at standard preservation levels. The microfilm and digital surrogates are available for consultation upon request. A color facsimile was produced in 2015 for inclusion in the online database Terre et Peuples du Québec Touris Siècle. The current metadata reads, author Louis-François Ducharme, 1856-1912. Title Journal de Terrain, Saint-François, 1895. Extent 42 folios, 23 centimeters. Language French. Subject Crown Land Survey. Indigenous occupation Abenaki. Repository Archives, Nationales du Québec, Quebec City. Nothing further is known about the Abenaki families mentioned. Their migration across the frontier left no continuous record on either side of the border. American customs ledgers for 1895 contain no entries corresponding to indigenous crossings at the Saint-François watershed. Missionary letters from Maine in the same period make no reference to arrivals from Quebec. The disappearance, therefore, may not have been movement, but omission the moment when observers ceased to write. In the historical catalogue of the Department of Crown Lands, the survey of March 1895 is indexed only by its administrative code, net numbered 84, 1895th Eastern Division. The summary line reads, survey completed. No further remarks. Every subsequent mention of Ducharme's journal depends on that brief description expanded only through archival recovery. The document has become both evidence and metaphor, a record of observation that outlived the observed. Today, scholars cite it not for its conclusions, but for its limits, for the way its abrupt ending exposes the boundary of state perception in the late 19th century. The notebook endures as a factual artifact, an account that neither explains nor interprets existing, precisely because it was routine. Its preservation allows reconstruction of a moment otherwise erased. Through the measured prose of a surveyor, one can still trace the geometry of vanished lives. The 7 bark lodges, the 4 canoes inverted on the shore, the sleds loaded for migration. Each entered into the record as data, each now an echo of existence. What remains unresolved is not the authenticity of the document, but the continuity of the people it recorded. Their descendants, dispersed among modern communities in Quebec, Maine, and Vermont, retain fragments of memory, family names, words for the lakes, recollections of seasonal travel, but no direct line to the 1895 settlement has been verified. The absence of corroborating oral tradition may reflect the rupture produced by early 20th century assimilation policies. The Ducharme journal thus occupies a narrow interval between visibility and silence, a final observation before omission, a closing sentence before archival stillness. Its endurance is accidental yet complete. In the catalogue, the final note entered by archivist Lapointe remains unchanged after 50 years. End of manuscript page 42 blank following final entry. No revision, no annotation, no interpretation has been added. The notebook continues to exist exactly as it was found, an object of record, not remembrance. The silence that follows its last line belongs neither to the surveyor nor to the people he described, but to the distance between them, a distance measured now only by the persistence of ink. In the study of frontier history, such documents constitute the outer edge of knowledge, where written testimony ends and the living trace begins. And so the record closes not as a conclusion, but as an opening toward what remains to be found. The historian's task is to continue listening to what the archive no longer says. From a frozen shore in 1895 to this screen today, one sentence has crossed centuries unchanged. It carried no emotion, no intention, only endurance. The record ends, but its echo still moves like water through time. What other forgotten lives do you think deserve to be rediscovered next? Comment your answer and let history hear you.